Today's topic is going to be economics. What's prompted this topic, I think at least in my own interest over the past few years, is that we've had a lot of speculation going back to, say, 2007, 2008, with the changing in the guard in Washington, as well as then in more recent history with our new Pope. There's been a lot of speculation about a creeping in of socialist tendencies into our economic mindset. I think in the former case, you can see that some of those fears might have been very well founded. In the latter case, I think you'll see in today's presentation that those fears are not well founded based on the teaching tradition of our church. Pope Francis' ministry has been very consistent with what the church has always taught regarding economics. He might have a different emphasis than some of his predecessors, but his papacy is really, I think, a papacy of continuity rather than a papacy of change. So what I want to do here in this 30 or 40 minutes or so is to go through some of the important principles of economics as the church has taught, particularly over the last 140 years or so, going back to a watershed document called Rerum Novarum that was written by Pope Leo XIII in 1891. Since then, there's been a series of 6 or 8, depending on who you ask, encyclicals that are focused on economics. Most recently being Centesimus Annus, written by Pope John Paul II 100 years after Rerum Novarum, so 1991. So what I want to do with you now is to just take a look at where does the church stand on this spectrum of communism or socialism on one end of the spectrum on the left versus capitalism on the right, so to speak. And hopefully we'll be able to point out some of the most important emphasis of the church, particularly regarding moral teaching. And I'd be happy to take questions or comments as we go on. All right. As we launch into this, though, I think it would be good to take a moment to consider the purpose of economy and to just kind of look at a history of how economy develops, going from the most simplest of economies to the more complex that we experience today. So we go through this progression from individual producers. So I hunt, I gather, I farm, I produce all of the things that me and my family need, right? So a very basic economy. We move from that, that's an economy really of true manufacturing. The term manufacture means to complete by hand, right? We usually don't use it in that sense now. But this very simple economy, moving to a system of more cooperative bartering. So we get these communities that come together. Each individual still produces some of what they need, and has an integral role in that production and in their consumption. But these individual producers join together in a network where I can focus a little bit more on what comes naturally to me or maybe what I'm good at, and then I can trade for those goods and services that I'm unable to provide for myself and for my family. So we get bartering. More specialized, but still not an exclusive specialization there. And so definitely a need for community involvement, right? And a need for care for your neighbor. The third level that, and again this is a drastic oversimplification, but really the third level that we're at now is this system in which a currency is created, right? Where instead of providing what I need and probably providing almost nothing of what I need. Most people today don't produce anything directly that they need. Instead of that, I offer a good or a service or some sort of labor that I exchange for money, and so we have currency that then we purchase the things that we need, right? Nothing inherently wrong with this, but there are some problems associated with this from a moral standpoint that the church has noted, and several prominent Catholic theorists have written extensively on, really going back to the early 1900s. And I'll mention some of their names as we go. A couple of the problems with that, number one is that we now have a society, not just in America, but kind of a global society that is largely incapable of producing themselves and is almost totally or sometimes totally dependent on currency to acquire the things that they need, right? Food, shelter, medical care, etc. Secondly, that currency then is a little bit divorced from the real goods that we hope to buy with it, right? We get this separation between money and that stuff that I need to buy with my money. And so it becomes harder to judge for each of us and harder then to acquire and retain the proper amount of money that we need, okay, to buy the things we need. This becomes a moral problem sometimes for the church, economically speaking, is that sometimes we end up then pursuing money rather than pursuing the things that we need, right? Where the things that we need are inherently good. We need food, we need shelter, we need those kind of things to provide for ourselves and our families. But instead of seeking those things, we're seeking money, and sometimes we fail to see how that money is supposed to translate into those things we need. For example, if I have a silo full of wheat, I can have a kind of concept of how much wheat I might need for my family during the next year. When I don't have any wheat, or I don't have any of the goods I need, now I just need these dollar bills or these numbers in my bank account to provide what I need. Well, it's a little bit harder to judge how much is adequate in that situation. So we start stockpiling money, essentially, and we start making deals based on money that's not based on our real needs. Do you see the difference there? And so we have people haggling about thousands of dollars or millions of dollars, and we're pursuing these numbers where it's not really translated to anything that we need. It's just money for its own sake. And that's one of the things that the church has noted ever since the late 1800s as being a problem with this progression of economy. Again, not inherently evil, but these are some real challenges that we have. And Pope Francis notes some of these challenges in his apostolic exhortation, for example. All right. A couple of general principles that we can get from the New Testament regarding what we're supposed to be doing with our money, primarily regarding our excess money. St. Paul talks about our need to allow our excess money, that we don't really need, to serve the real needs of other people. I think it was St. Augustine who put it this way. He said, if you have 2 coats in your closet, one of them rightfully belongs to the poor. Okay, and so our superabundance should be providing for the necessity of others. Secondly, there's a great deal of teaching in the New Testament about the evils of being attached to money, right? Pursuing money for its own sake, fearing the loss of money when that fear is not really tied to any real needs, where we're serving money rather than serving God, where money becomes an idol for us, right? And we devote all of our attention to it, we devote all of our focus to it, and it becomes more important than losing our relationships, and then even losing our relationship with God. So we see people putting that money on that pedestal. That becomes a problem. Some of the major principles that the church has consistently taught regarding economy. Number one is that people are always ends, they are never means. Okay? We're never allowed to use a person as the means to pursue our own ends. So if I decide that I need something, and then I see John in the audience, and I say, I think I could really use John to get what I want. Okay? Whether that's small or big, whether what I want is a minor thing or a major thing, that's always sinful to use somebody as a means to achieve an end. The church has consistently taught that human beings are always ends in themselves. That's who we serve, people, not the other way around. Our faith calls us always to love people and to use things. We love people and we use things. We use things to love people, so we kind of get a cyclical effect there. Our society, on the other hand, tends, I think, to teach us that we're supposed to use people and to love things, right? Kind of our materialistic mindset. That's what we fall into. That's a warning in economics that we need to consider. All right? People are not made for the economy is made for people. something that John Paul II echoed from Leo XIII in his encyclical Centesimus Annus, is that from either end of the spectrum, whether you're talking about an ultra-liberal communist system of economy or an ultra-conservative capitalist form of economy, at either end of those spectrums, John Paul II said, we end up using people as means to an end. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. So that's always a warning for economy. Pope Francis, he reminds us of that in Evangelii Gaudium, is that economy is to serve the needs of people. And then we have a particular need to care for those that are most vulnerable among us. In addition to these sins involving economy, there's also a lot of other related problems that can be tied to economic causes. So our economic sins translate often into mistakes, at least, even if they're not sinful, mistakes in how we run the rest of our life. So, for example, when we become dominated with an economic mindset that's based on utilitarianism, that's based on using people to get what I want, that starts to influence the way we educate, for example. We start training people to be employees rather than forming them to be people. I always rankle when I hear the word train. Training is what we do to dogs, right? Training is not what we do to human beings. We form human beings, we educate them. But when we start thinking of people as producers and consumers, then we're not so concerned with that whole person development. That's just one example. And I think you'll see some more of those as we go on in our teaching. So one of the general principles that the church always tries to look to in its economic policies is the need and the desire for subsidiarity whenever possible. And so subsidiarity is saying that when possible, it's always best to solve a problem or to address a concern or a need at the smallest and at the most local means possible. Okay, that's an important theme that's applied to economic as well as social welfare policies. It tends to be the most efficient. It tends to call people to task on their responsibility to their fellow man. And it also calls people to responsibility to their communities. Some of the reasons that this is emphasized by the church. Something that comes to mind, I like history, and after the stock market crash of 1929, Herbert Hoover was our president. He was a Republican. Herbert Hoover was lampooned for suggesting that perhaps private charities, like the church and individuals, might be most responsible for trying to help rebuild the economy. People lampooned him for it. They called, they called the tenements Hoovervilles. If you remember hearing about that. Herbert Hoover, by the way, was the first president in U.S. history to donate every dime that he made as president to charity. He didn't keep a cent that he earned as president. I think JFK did that too. I don't think anybody's done that since then. I could be wrong. FDR, as you know, brought in the New Deal, and it was kind of his idea that we need to get this enormous government, and that it's more the government's responsibility to care for the needs of citizens. A couple of graphics to show what's going on here. The one on the left would be exhibiting the principle of subsidiarity, right? So we have the smallest on the top. The most removed from individuals is least responsible for the end result. Okay, so we have a smaller federal government, a relatively smaller local government, and more of the emphasis on the individual. This is a very Catholic way of looking at who is supposed to be solving our problems, as opposed to this kind of inverted pyramid where we have this balloon at the top, and whereas the individual may have very little connection to what's going on. Another way to illustrate it is in this way. So we can either have this large agency that's trying to serve our economic needs, or a bunch of small local organizations. You see that this large one that's further removed, number one, it only has one point of contact, or far fewer points of contact, and it's got a lot further to go. So there's a lot more waste, it's done a lot less efficiently. Whereas with a local, when all of us are responsible for it, we can pinpoint where the needs need to be met. We've got a lot more points of contact, and we've got a lot less waste, so to speak. All right. But so those principles tend to support, more the right or more the conservative side. But the conservative side is not without its need for correction, according to the church, as well. Namely, in problems with corporations, for example. Note, kind of as a completion to the previous slide, that oftentimes conservatives are thought of as being heartless by some of their counterparts. So they say, well, wait a minute, you don't care about the poor because you don't think we should have higher taxes or programs or whatever it may be. I mean, give me a break. That couldn't be further from the truth when you talk about authentic, religious-centered conservative economics. I look at like the story of Lazarus in the gospel. Whose responsibility was it to care for Lazarus? It was the rich man who was right in front of him, right? It was his responsibility. He was the one who was held liable in judgment for his neglect of Lazarus. It wasn't King Herod. It wasn't the Romans. It was Lazarus. And by extension, if you notice in John's gospel, a lot of scholars, there's a big debate, but a lot of scholars think that the Lazarus, who's a friend of Jesus, whom he raised from the dead, a lot of people think it's the same guy, and they've got some really good reasons for that. So when Lazarus, who died, and Jesus rose from the dead, you remember what Jesus' reaction was when he came to his home and found that he was dead? He was angry. It said that Jesus was angry, and he looked angrily at the crowd. Well, why would he have been angry? It seems to me, and it seems to others who read that story, that it was because it was their responsibility to care for Lazarus' needs. They were the ones that he was entrusted to as his community. All right? But kind of moving to the other side of the spectrum, with some of the problems that we have with the corporate mindset is that we have this system where we're creating corporations which are considered by the IRS to be persons, right? I mean, a corporation files its taxes as a person. But the problem with a corporation is that it doesn't have a soul, right? It's not really a person. And so, as such, a corporation can be an impersonal entity that causes some moral problems. When we support corporations, for example, especially large corporations, we're supporting not a person, but a thing, right? One time I saw a sign that said, when you buy from, I can't remember the name of the corporation, whether it was Walmart or whoever it was, but it said when you buy from them, you help their CEO to get a new vacation home. When you buy from the local guy, you help his daughter to get braces. I mean, just this idea that we're supporting things that are getting further and further removed from the needs of individuals in our community. So there's some real problems there, I think, morally. Secondly, as a impersonal entity, corporations can legally, and they will, do things that no God-fearing individual person would do. Okay, they will do things, they will skirt the law in various ways, they're enabled to do that, and they'll do things to their employees that you or I wouldn't do to our employees. You understand what I'm saying? Because it's not a person taking care of another person. It's a corporation that has all these officers and other employees whose best interest is to serve that corporation, not each other. Right? Do you see how that works? If I'm a CEO of a corporation, I'm worried about the bottom line of that corporation, how the IRS sees that they did that year, or doesn't see how they did that year. Don't get me on that other topic. I'm not concerned. If I've got to sell somebody else down the river, I might do that. If I've got to cut somebody, I might do that because I'm not concerned about the individuals working there. I'm concerned about the bottom line of the organization itself. That's a very different thing, economically speaking and morally speaking. A couple other issues that the church has pointed out, somewhat unpopularly, is that there's a big problem with usury, with the idea of lending money at interest. There's a real moral problem that we need to talk about when it comes to this. I've included a quote from one of my favorite authors, John Sr., pointing out that the mindset of usury gives us a really distorted view of what we should be producing and what we should not be producing. So loaning money to somebody at interest, which, by the way, was very strictly forbidden in the Old Testament, to some degree, whenever we do that, we are taking advantage of the fact that we have and that somebody else doesn't have. No matter which way you slice it, that's what you're doing. You're saying, I have this, and because you don't have it, I'm going to make some profit from you for that. Okay. Additional moral problems that come with money lending come, for example, when lenders take advantage of the ignorance or the irresponsibility or perhaps the desperate condition of people who are borrowing. That's become on the forefront of Catholic social teaching, particularly over the last decade with the rise of these kind of loan shark places that are up on seemingly every corner that will give people money at exorbitant interest rates, and knowing full well that they probably don't understand the terms of that agreement, with the full hope and desire that that person won't be able to repay the loan and that they'll be able to reclaim the original amount and seize any property that was purchased, and there'll be no skin off their hide for it. I mean, this is totally immoral. There's no way to justify that kind of behavior. That's an extreme example, but I think it shows some of the concern here. Banks sell money. I mean, that's what they do. I'm not saying that they're inherently evil, but that's what a bank does. It sells you money. You go to any store, they're always selling you something. Well, a bank is a money store. And when you go there, you say, I would like that dollar bill from you. And they'd say, okay, great. Write me an IOU for $1.20 or $1.50 or $2 or $5 or $10, and we'll make a transaction. We kind of make that more palatable on all the commercials. It's, people hugging and we're helping this family do this. But I think there's a different way of looking at that. I saw a commercial the other day when I was exercising, and it said 3.95% financing, and had all these terms on there. I couldn't hear it because it was just on in the gym. And then the next picture was people riding jet skis. And so it was, we'll finance you a new jet ski for 3.95%. Because as we all know, jet skis are necessities for modern Americans, right? I mean, you can't live without your jet ski. So if you can't afford it, don't worry, we'll finance it to you. And maybe we'll be able to reclaim it from you later when you can't pay for it. So we've got this really disordered tendency on the part of the people that are able to exploit, and on our part as consumers that we're willing to be part of it. Okay. So what does the church, in a positive sense, I've been talking a lot about the church, what the church doesn't tend to want, but what does the church want? The church has consistently and clearly stated the positive nature of private property. That private property is a good thing, and it's something that we have to fight for. Private property is something that celebrates human dignity. It's something that recognizes us as people rather than as producers or consumers. Private property is something that encourages stewardship. It encourages us to take care of what we have. It's been consistently emphasized as a top priority in economics by the church. That hasn't changed, okay, that emphasis on private property. Private property lends itself to freedom. One theologian said that the whole goal of a Christian life is to unite human freedom with divine freedom. I mean, that's a pretty simple way to state what the life of faith is all about. We're trying to unite God's freedom with our freedom. So Catholicism always supports freedom in an authentic sense. Private property is one of the things that play a role in that. When we can have private property, that enables us to be more free, to serve God, to take care of His creation, to serve our neighbor. Okay. What many prominent Catholic theorists have come up with as an alternative to this is something called distributism. Something that captured my attention probably 10 years ago. And I keep finding more and more authors that are writing about it. The principles of distributism can be found in many of the economic and social encyclicals of the church. It's not explicitly endorsed by the Pope. We don't have any popes saying, hey, you should all be distributists. But the principles are very much Catholic principles. And basically what distributism says is that it recognizes that it doesn't really matter whether individuals are subservient to the state. It doesn't matter whether the state owns or whether corporations own. It says that if you're ignoring human dignity, the result's the same. So capitalism and communism really end up in the same place if you allow them to take their full effect. G.K. Chesterton, who is one of the founding fathers of distributism, he says this in his book Outline of Sanity. He says, what I complain of in the current defense of existing capitalism is that it is a defense of keeping most men in wage dependence, that is, keeping most men without capital. And so Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc and Christopher Dawson, more recently Wendell Berry, there's a lot of guys writing about this, essentially saying that if we're tied only to wage consumption, that's really limiting our freedom. This is kind of the alternative that promotes private property, and it emphasizes our natural freedoms. All right, we can talk more about distributism a little bit later if we have time. If you're interested in this topic, come to the Catholic Culture Conference. This is one of the topics that's going to be discussed there. Dale Ahlquist is coming. He's an international expert on G.K. Chesterton and some of his economic ideas. But I want to move on to a couple of other issues so that we can have time for a few questions at the end. One of the principles of conservative economics historically has tended to be this idea of laissez-faire, the idea that you kind of just take your hands off the economy and you let market indicators decide policies. So you just kind of see where supply and demand meet, and that's the value of goods, that's how you pay people wages. You just kind of don't mess with it and you let it do its own thing. That's also a problem for the church. The church has consistently said we can't leave economic factors purely to market conditions. We've got to be intentional about how we form our economies. We've got to make choices and make policies that support what we want the economy to do. We can't just throw our hands back. So that kind of extreme right-wing idea of going back to like Adam Smith, laissez-faire, just let it do its own thing, that's not really consistent with what the church teaches either. We have a responsibility to make these intentions, our decisions intentionally. For example, it's unjust to sell something at a price that's so low that other people, for example, smaller proprietors, can't compete with your price. Okay? Even if the market conditions allow you to do that, even if I can afford to do that, that's unjust. You'd say, no, you can't sell that widget for $5 when nobody else can afford to sell it for less than $6 because you're going to run everybody else out of business. There's something unjust in doing that, at least drastically. The difference of $1 would probably be okay, but when you're saying I can sell it for $5, nobody else can sell it for less than $100, what am I doing? I'm going to drive everybody else out of business. The church would say even if the market conditions allow you to do that, that's not just. Also, it's unjust to pay a person less than a fair and just wage. This is something that the church has consistently taught, that we have to pay fair and just wages. We ought not just pay what the markets indicate that we have to. An important part of Catholic economics has always been the idea of the family wage, for instance. The idea of paying people enough that both spouses don't have to be employed outside of the home. That's largely become a lost concept because the market conditions have dictated, well, this is all I have to pay somebody because there's so much competition. And so you can talk about, there's a historian, Alan Carlson, who's written extensively about the history of that historically before World War II, Catholic theorists had fought vigorously to preserve the idea of a family wage. During World War II, there were restrictions, federal restrictions on paying different wages based on sex. The family wage system was still able to continue for another couple of decades based on differentiation in jobs, okay? Eventually in the 60s with the Civil Rights Act, it kind of destroyed the whole idea of the family wage, okay? The church has noted that this is a problem. Pope Pius XI, in his encyclical Quadragesimo Annuum, said this. He said, "It's an intolerable abuse and to be abolished at all cost for mothers on account of their father's low wage to be forced to engage in gainful occupations outside the home to the neglect of their proper cares and duties, especially the training of children. Every effort must therefore be made that the fathers of families receive a wage large enough to meet ordinary family needs adequately." He said that in 1931, a long time ago, but Catholic teaching doesn't change, right? At least in nature. And so that's just one economic concern that we have in the church that we're encouraged to think about when we make our decisions in the ability that we have. A couple other notes just real quickly is our popes have noted a problem with a labor-centered view of economy, the overexaltation of labor. Pope Leo, for example, noted that labor is really an effect of original sin. And basically what Leo said was, man was always going to be engaged in something, but only after original sin did our attention become devoted to labor. And there's a kind of a distinction in terms there. What he was saying is that without sin, we would have just been being leisurely all the time. Leisurely in an authentic sense, meaning we would have been doing the things that were natural to man. We would have been taking care of his creation, and we would have been doing things very productively. Labor, if you remember from Genesis 3, is a result of original sin, that we would be toiling. And that's the way it's usually translated in our Bibles. Toil means that we're working hard to do something, but we're not really accomplishing what we want to accomplish. So with that in mind, the church has always had this healthy understanding that the goal of the Christian life is the Sabbath, right? The Sabbath tradition where the cycle of rest dominates our life, that we regularly take time to abstain from the servile conditions of work, and we focus on the more human things. All right, and that's supposed to really set the tone for our entire life, not just the Sabbath day. How do we live that out? Well, that's more difficult. Engaging in leisure, properly speaking, is an important way that we do that. We're all familiar with this deadly sin of sloth, right? Well, we mistakenly define sloth as laziness sometimes, whereas sloth has nothing to do with laziness or inactivity. What sloth is a denial of doing the things that you're supposed to be doing. Leisure. Likewise, leisure is not doing nothing. I Googled, I was trying to find a good picture for leisure, and I just Googled it, and every picture that came up, I kid you not, on the screen, it was full of people laying on a hammock at the beach. There's nothing else. That's what leisure is to our culture, is doing nothing. Okay? Now there's a time for that. There's a time for just total relaxation and recharging, but that's not what leisure is. Leisure is doing the authentically human things, art, charity, husbandry of nature, all these things that are truly human. That's what leisure is, and that's really the goal of the Christian life. All right, we're almost out of time, and I know some people have to get back to work, so I'm going to close with a quote from one of my favorite authors, Wendell Berry. This is what he says. He says, "Public absurdities are and can be no more than the aggregate result of private absurdities. The corruption of community has its source in the corruption of our character. This realization has become the typical moral crisis of our time. Once our personal connection to what is wrong becomes clear, then we have to choose. We can go on as before, recognizing our dishonesty and living with it the best we can, or we can begin an effort to change the way we think and the way we live."